All right, good morning. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Good morning.
In this, I think I'm counting right, the 6th installment of substituting for Robert. And Terry, you're doing next week? And we'll see after that, huh? But I did see Robert on Monday when I helped Madeline get him in the car to go home, and he looked really good compared to a week earlier. And Sue saw him yesterday, and she says, "Oh my God, he looks so good!" Yeah, Madeline told me y'all were over there, so that's wonderful. And I'm sure he's soaking up that love. So great. I'm going to open with a reading of the 114th Psalm from Psalm for Praying, which is the Psalms just kind of rephrased, and not just an interpretation, but a rephrasing, and I think you'll catch it. Come, all you who have wandered far from the path, who have separated yourselves from love. A banquet is prepared for you in the heart's secret room. There you will find the way home. A welcome ever awaits you. Even as you acknowledge the times you have erred, the forgiveness of the beloved will envelop you. Call upon the beloved when fear arises, when you feel overwhelmed. The eternal listener will heed your cry. You will find strength to face the shadows. Befriend all that is within you. Discover the secret room in your heart. Then will abundant blessings enter your home, and you will welcome the divine guest who is ever with you. And a couple of things in there kind of stood out at me. The heart's secret room sounds like Jesus' invitation to, when you pray, go into your secret room, close the door, and pray in secret, and your Father who hears in secret will reward you. And then the other thing that I heard in there was, befriend all that is within you. And that sounds like a challenge. I mean, how can I befriend all that's in here? I mean, yeah, you have no idea. I mean, it's, you know, the gifted speaker and wonderful soul and all that. Probably true, but also I can feel like a fraud because I'm petty and I complain and get impatient, and so to befriend that too, that's a real challenge. But I think if I don't, then I'm like trying to pretend it doesn't exist. I'm walling it off, and I'm keeping the shadow self in the shadow, and unless it comes in the light, how's it going to get healed? So what I heard in that whole passage, though, was a call to move from head-centered thinking and existing and being to heart-centered. Ooh, I like that. Yeah. In the head, it's, it wants control. And it works on logic, right and wrong, win and lose, fairness. And from the heart, we're able to embrace paradox and mystery, which is really what is. Because we don't really understand how love can express through some of these horrible things in the world. And yet, if God is all and in all, then God has to be in that horrible situation, whatever it is. You know, a war or an argument or an impatient
situation.
Person screaming at his helper who got something wrong. The next day, I was riding with my helper. I was under the house that day, and he just got the instruction wrong. And I've been waiting for him under the house, and he's supposed to bring me stuff, and it was wrong, and I had to wait longer. And the next day, we rode in the car together to San Marcos, and I just had this. It's in my head all the time. Come to me, all you who are weary, and he heard me singing that. He goes, "Oh, I heard you singing that under the house yesterday." I was ready to call the ambulance. Yeah. So yeah, you know, it does kind of. It's a way of knitting something into us to have that. Because I mean, we can, you know, if our influences are talk radio or TV or something, we can knit into us influences that are a lot less helpful than that. And he might hear me spouting something not so helpful. He might still want to call an ambulance. So, Bruce, the song choices seem like spot on, by the way. And we did talk about surrender, 4 weeks ago now? And how it's giving up control, and I use control in air quotes because it's something we never had anyway. It's an illusion. It's the false self that we built up from earliest childhood. It's not our fault, but we get feedback, and we have certain receptors in us, and some of us, those receptors that are having to do with power and control, get set off, and we have to protect those. And so for us, power and control is just inordinately important. For others of us, it's affection, esteem, approval, pleasure. And if something is holding us back from that, or somebody doesn't think that, you know, give us the pat on the back we want, then we have to go out of our way to get that approval or affection. And then there's survival and security. You know, we're so, you know, safety is the most important thing, and so we are just inordinately worried about safety and mindful of it, and mindful in a certain way, maybe not in a higher sense, habitual sense, maybe. But that makes us feel like we're in control. And it's a mechanical thing. We don't even know what's going on. I mean, when I interrupt people to tell them some funny joke or a pun that they said that they didn't realize, and they're going to think it's so funny, I'm not being conscious that I'm seeking this approval that isn't coming, because they don't like being interrupted and having their grammar straight. Yeah, funny how that is. But yeah, the control is never really there anyway. But letting go of that unconscious clinging to safety or approval or power, it's a surrender. It's hard. And we have to do it over and over again. And I'm probably not unique in that it's not just the approval pleasure that's my thing. You know, I have my moments where I'm in a power struggle, and I, for 40 years, have set myself here and Ginger there because she's so safety conscious and I'm not. No. Well, guess what? After enough time sitting in the silence and letting go of thoughts and having layers of false self strip away, I realized, oh wow, I'm doing this just so that I can make it and be safe and secure. And so they're all in there. And again, like I say, it's nobody's fault. It's what happens because we grow up in an imperfect, outside of the Garden of Eden, everything was perfect, and we're outside of there, and guess what? It's the way it's supposed to be because this is God's world, God's universe, and God is here, right now, and in that whatever situation that is over there. And we are we're told that we're made in the image and the likeness of God. And I wonder sometimes, how can that be? That if we're in the image and likeness of God, the universe is, that we're told that the Christ, St. Paul says that the body of Christ is everything and everybody. And if that's the case, then how can we have wars? How can we have accidents that are disasters? And how can we forget to pick our daughter up from school? Oops, sorry, I never did that when I was... But in the Quest class, we were talking about how God is all good, and we come to realize that, but sometimes our definition of what is good is pretty narrow. And that if God is infinite, my mind can't wrap around the infinite. So there is a mystery of how this all flows, and could be that there could be all good and seeming not good at the same time. So I had a passage I heard on the retreat that I was on with the Mennonites last weekend. The pastor set up a pretty cool program. The first 2 days Ginger ran as a silent retreat. He just gave it to her, actually gave it to us, but I was working. So Ginger took it over and ran it, and it was lovely. But then the rest of it was not silent, and there were classes and groups and activities, but at every meal, he set the whole weekend up around the 4th chapter of Mark. And he broke it up into passages or, verses, and gave those to people and said, I would like you to read this at a meal and comment on it. So there was music and a little gospel reading and a commentary at each meal. And it was by just different people. And my daughter did one, and it happens to be this one. But so I'm going to read it. This is from the 4th chapter of Mark, verses 26 through 29. And this Bible says, the seed grows of itself. He also said, this is how it is with the reign of God. A man scatters seed on the ground. He goes to bed, gets up day after day. Through it all, the seed sprouts and grows without his knowing how it happens. The soil produces of itself first the blade, then the ear, finally ripe wheat in the ear. When the crop is ready, he wields the sickle, for the time is ripe for the harvest. And kind of in the spirit, we may actually have done this in Lectio Divina over the weekend, but when I finally heard, when my daughter was reading this in front of the whole group on Sunday morning, that this is how it is with the version she said, the kingdom of God. That a man scatters seed on the ground, he goes to bed, but through it all the seed sprouts, and he doesn't know what's happening. He doesn't even know what's going to happen. And this is how it is with the kingdom of God. So it sounds like that Jesus was telling us that God is not this controlling, I'm going to pull levers and make this happen and that happen that God trusts. And God throws seeds out here and lets them grow up, and some of them turn into something what we call beautiful and lovely, and some of them turn into something that we call difficult. What was that?
Weeds.
Yeah, there you go. And that's not the concept of God that I grew up with. You know, that God knows everything and God controls everything. It's all powerful. Well, maybe all powerful, but God's loving, and loving is not really controlling. God is love. If it's really love, how can it be controlling? So that just really kind of brought me around to, I think it's waking up kind of a new concept of God and embracing mystery, which, believe me, sitting in the silence every day for year after year, you kind of get to where you can embrace mystery and paradox. This is Job and the Mystery of Suffering by Richard Rohr. And I just wanted to read this little thing here. The striking fact about the book of Job is that God does not seem eager to appear as the hero. Let me just stop a second. I don't know if any of y'all have ever read the book of Job. Everybody knows the story. The book it's really different from most of the rest of the Bible. It's really different. And in it, Job he's blessed and he's very righteous and does everything right. He lives right and he's rewarded. And then something happens. Famine, plagues, and loses all his children, loses his wife, loses all his crops, his animals. He's got nothing. He's sitting on an ash heap, throwing ashes on him or something, and his 3 friends come and berate him for like 28 chapters. You must have done something wrong in your thinking. Your thinking led to this. And he, because God wouldn't do this to you if you hadn't brought this on. And he never gives in. He doesn't, well, I don't know I shouldn't say what he doesn't do. He doesn't go to this, okay, I brought this on, this is punishment for my sin or something. And in the end, he just gives up and surrenders and says, I got nothing. I don't know what might happen. And then all of a sudden, the last chapter, everything's restored to him. So it's kind of odd and interesting. And God just lets it all happen. God, at least as it's presented in the book of Job, did not send the plague down. In a lot of the books of the Bible, it is attributed to God. God did send the plague. God did let the Israelites smash these people to bits because he favors them, or he did let them get smashed to bits because they hadn't been worshiping him properly. This is different. And he doesn't appear as a hero. On the contrary, Yahweh is quite content to let Job emerge finally heroic. This divine modesty is true not only of this book, but of all our history. When you have real authority, you do not have to prove it. When you are truly in charge, you do not have to go throwing your weight around. In the book of Job, therefore, God does not burst on the scene like Superman to solve the problem. Instead, Yahweh remains quietly on the edge, observing and trusting. When you know you're in charge, you can wait, because you know that you have the power to bring things together. It's a lesson not only in ultimate authority, but also in the patience and even the humility of God. Sometimes people who know God well presume that God would use the power the way they would use power, as a dominative force. They want a deus ex machina, a magician God who appears out of the wings to solve the problem. The paradox of the book of Job is that Yahweh remains totally present in power, yet to all appearances does nothing. And for 37 chapters, God says nothing. It's our worst nightmare, a silent, hidden, and ineffective God. And yet, we're told that God expresses through me, through you. And so, I guess he's as ineffective as we let him be. Huh? And what this kind of, my progression here is that we have I mentioned briefly the false self earlier, that we have this belief system and an attitude structure that we grow up with that Father Thomas Keating and before him Thomas Merton called the false self. And it's how we get by in the world. And it's built even further on an education, how to live in the world, in the real world that we call the real world. And it's necessary. It's necessary to know how to treat people fairly, to give people in exchange for something. And yet we find that that's not how God works. Jesus tells us how the parable of the workers, that some of them come early in the morning and they work all day long. And the landowner says, this isn't progressing fast enough. In the mid-morning he gets some more, brings them in. So they've worked a few hours less. Middle of the day he gets some more, brings them in. At the end of the day, they're still not finished. He goes and gets some more workers, and they work for the last hour. And then he pays them all the same amount. So we have this first half of life thinking and education that's important, and yet if we think that's all there is, then we have a pretty narrow existence, because we've shut out all this paradox and this beauty and mystery. My note says creative tension, that this second half of life allows us to embrace creative tension. We have, on the one hand, at the most obvious, you've got creativity and new life and new growth coming up, and then we've got destruction happening at the same time. Or that for new life to come up, this old life has to die. Those are in a lot of Jesus' parables too. And that's not the kind of thinking that our logic and right and wrong really embrace all that easily. So we have what's sometimes called an awakening. It doesn't happen, it can happen all at once. We're told that St. Paul on the road to Damascus, had this bolt of lightning, and he went from executing Christians to being their apostle missionary. And but for most of us, it's one little awakening after another, and it can be painful at times. Each one of those little awakenings. For St. Paul, that was really painful. He was blind for 3 days. And the rest of his life, he carried around a thorn in his side. And nobody knows quite what that means, but it's something. And he prayed to have this taken away from him, and God never saw fit to take it away from him. He had this thorn in his side for the rest of his life, and he lived a pretty old age till he was executed. So it's not necessarily easy or smooth and fun, and yet it's joyful. It opens us up to joy. We're able to embrace and see joy in more situations. All right, I'm going to see if I can fit all these in. There's some good little things here. I've got the it takes a shift in our thinking. It causes a shift in our thinking, and when our old thinking looks at this new thinking, it thinks it's crazy. How can it be that this is good, that a hurricane or a earthquake can create a tsunami that killed millions of people? This is from Paul's first letter to Corinthians, chapter 3, verse 18 through something or another. Let no one delude himself. If any of you thinks he is wise in a worldly way, he had better become a fool. In that way, he will really be wise. For the wisdom of the world is absurdity with God. Scripture says he catches the wise in their craftiness. And again, the Lord knows how empty are the thoughts of the wise. Let there be no boasting about men. All things are yours, whether it be Paul or Apollos or Cephas, or the world or life or death, or the present or the future. All these are yours, and you are Christ's, and Christ is God's. So it's all good, it's all God. And we've been told that for at least 2,000 years. But Job was even before that. So we've been told a really long time, and yet our false self are still pretty much stuck in that same paradigm. And what that false self, being stuck in that little narrow box, it brings on suffering. It causes suffering. And there is a distinction between necessary suffering and unnecessary suffering. And when we stay in that little box, or try to, or deny that it is a little box, and it brings that kind of suffering, is called unnecessary suffering. Because that's something that we can move beyond. Then there's necessary suffering, where we go and we embrace the world, and we help somebody like the Mennonites in San Antonio are helping these immigrants get dropped off at the bus station. They are suffering, let me tell you. They're suffering. And the immigration authorities, they've had them in detention, and it's time to release them, and they just drop them off in the bus station in San Antonio, and they don't know how to get to where they're going. They don't know anybody, and they don't have any resources. And there are some groups down there, the Catholic Charities and the Mennonites are the two major players, and they just have people stationed at the bus station and say, all right, come here, we'll find a place for you to spend the night. They give them something to eat, put some clothes on them, and then send them on their way. Because they've got somebody somewhere waiting for them, like in Illinois or Oregon or Georgia, so it's crazy. And that kind of suffering we're calling necessary, because it's serving God in humanity. I can remember early in Unity, and this may be putting it the same thing in a different way. I heard the saying that pain is mandatory, suffering is optional. So, life throws stuff at us. And it doesn't mean we can't be joyful in the midst of that. This is from Fruits and Gift of the Spirit by Thomas Keating. For most people, ordinary life is characterized by the sense that God is absent. Yet a little metaphysics would alert us to the fact that if God were not present at every moment, we would not be here either. Creation is not a one-time event. It's God's ongoing gift on every level, from the humblest quark to the highest stage of consciousness. St. Teresa of Avila wrote, "All difficulties in prayer can be traced to one cause, praying as if God were absent." This is the conviction that we bring with us from early childhood and apply to everyday life and to our lives in general. It gets stronger as we grow up, unless we are touched by the gospel and begin the spiritual journey. This journey is a process of dismantling the monumental illusion that God is distant or absent. When our particular petitions are not answered, we become even more convinced that God is absent. There's that narrow definition of good, right? This is an irrational position, however, one based on the judgment of emotion, not reason. Unfortunately, our unruly emotions do not obey reason or will. They have their own dynamic. Whenever our reason and will decide to do something, our emotions get into a huddle and decide whether or not they will go along with them. If our plan contradicts their perception of what is pleasant or unpleasant, we have a riot on our hands. The start, middle, and end of the spiritual journey is the conviction that God is always present. The start, beginning, and end of the spiritual journey is the conviction that God is always present. And what are we reading? Oh, I just did that one. Okay. I don't need this other. So this awakening that happens in us is, how am I doing? I got time? I got 30 minutes. Madeline?
30 seconds. 30 seconds.
I brought a few Zen sayings with me. You're going to let me get through the Zen sayings, right? Question: is there anything I can do to make myself enlightened? Answer: as little as you can do to make the sun rise in the morning. Question: then of what use are the spiritual exercises you prescribe? Answer: to make sure you are not asleep when the sun rises. And before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. Or after enlightenment, the laundry. So our life goes on because we're in this life that goes on to some point. But as long as we're here, we might as well live it. And embracing a daily practice, sitting in the silence twice a day, and giving selfless service is a way to live this life and honor the Christ in all of creation. And I know that there are people in this room that do this phenomenally well. I mean, look at this guy back here.
You ain't Tommy.
And I just singled him out because I just happen to personally know of his selfless sacred service over and over and over again. And I know that most of us here do that as well. If I got to wrap it up, If I have to wrap it up, I guess I'll close. I mean, there's some good stuff here, guys. I'm going to close with from Psalms for Praying, the 132nd Psalm. And this is actually an excerpt. I'm not even reading the whole thing. So relax. Enter into the silence, into the heart of truth. For herein lies the great mystery, where life is ever unfolding. Listen to the music of the Holy Word in the resounding silence of the universe. May balance and harmony be your aim as you are drawn into the heart of love. Wise are those who learn through silence. Listen then to listen well. For beyond the silence and stillness within, you will come to know a profound and dazzling silence. And herein lies the music of the spheres, the harmony of creation. Enter into the holy temple of your soul. Converse with the beloved in sweet communion. Blessings of the great silence be with you as you help rebuild the heart of the world with love.
Amen.